I'm really happy to present you Sundas, our guest today, who is an architect and urbanist. And I will actually present Sundas more about your background because there is a lot to talk about. And yeah, I'm really happy that you're here. Please tell us more. What is your past?
Thank you. Thanks for having me and introducing me. Yeah, as Luba said, I'm an architect and an urbanist, but I do not limit myself to my training either. Dabbled with lots of different fields, including migration, including gender and justice, including the energy sector, and more recently, sustainable supply chains. And while it's quite meandering, it's also a lot of fun to explore different themes and then bring them together in one way or the other.
And when you talk about that you are architect, right, but you or an urbanist, you basically studied different disciplines additionally to that, or how was it actually for you? How was it organized for you that you were in parallel just studying, or you were working on some projects and learning by doing? What was your main background?
I guess it's been a combination of different things. My architecture degree was very like mainstream architecture. It was at a university in Pakistan. So very much focused on structures, very much focused on design, a few minors on urban studies as well. But because it was an art university, I was also exposed to other disciplines. So that was quite inspiring. And then it was after I graduated that I felt that there was a gap of sorts of creative people practicing urban interventions, so to say. Of course, there's the whole government doing what they need to do, but that becomes a bit too mainstreamed and it really lacks creativity. So I think that's where I really started doing projects of my own, which is the links that I shared with you. And then I got into an Erasmus Mundus master's called 4 Cities. And as the name suggests, it was in 4 cities, in 6 universities. And as exciting as it was quite a unique experience to be able to go to these 4 cities and to really see how governments practice.
Which ones were those cities?
Yes, so we started off in Brussels and then moved on to Vienna and then Copenhagen and then Madrid. I wrote my thesis on Amsterdam and Islamabad, so I guess that's a 5th city that I was exposed to. And yes.
Yeah, but so it's really great that you are talking about that, because basically the general question, which we are really interested in to explore in this series of discussions with urbanists, is actually the differences of approaches in urbanism in Asia and in Europe. And since you have background or you worked in both contexts, could you tell more, maybe before we talk about particular projects you worked on, which were your main actual experiences of projects? Where did you work actually, first of all, in Asia or in Europe? You mentioned some cities, but you probably worked more, right, in other places. And what were those projects, just to give people a sense of geography?
Yeah. Sure. So in Pakistan, I mostly focused on the city of Rawalpindi. It's a neighboring city of Islamabad, which is the capital. It's the 4th largest city, quite complex, quite dense compared to a lot of European cities. I relate to it a lot as well because it's where my parents come from. It's where I went to university. So there's definitely a personal connection there. And within Europe, I think in terms of executing projects, I've mostly done it from an academic perspective. My work in Europe has not been urban because I've been doing so many different things. But the urban things that I have undertaken was in Vienna, we designed a project, an urban intervention project that we then presented to the city municipality to give them certain ideas on how to upgrade this particular neighborhood, which was sort of in the suburbs, but the intention was to connect it to the city, but then also create some kind of vibrancy and public spaces for the people there. And then there was also a project that I did in Portugal in a summer camp, where we were proposing certain urban interventions in this small town called Abrantes. And as is the case with a lot of southern European countries, is that especially in the smaller cities, we see that there's a negative migration, that a lot of the youngsters want to move to bigger cities. So this small city was really a victim of that. And almost every year, they're called Camp 180, Canal 180, if I remember correctly. They do a summer camp. They bring in a lot of artists and urbanists and a lot of multidisciplinary people who try to bring a lot of life to the city within a week or 10 days, to sort of see what can be done with this negative migration. Yeah, those are some of the projects that I've undertaken.
Yeah, and so maybe indeed we can first, indeed, before to talk about general context and general questions, which I mentioned that we will approach it about the main differences of urban projects and urban context in Asia and in Europe, because we are here more familiar maybe with European context. Maybe it would be great if you could tell us more about the project which you did in Pakistan, but it was a project which was way more, right? It was not just involving, if I understand, it's well, just Pakistan people, right? Because it was coordinated by international organizations. So can you please tell us more about it? One of the, yeah, this is the main question I think I have for now on this.
Sure. So the project started really from the urban platform at UNDP, which is sort of an experiment platform that they have, and they want to scale it up. And they did a pilot project in the city of Rawalpindi, and that was to assess what kind of challenges do they really face without really putting an agenda on it, but sort of like a feasibility study to see where do they stand, how is the municipality structured, what is the role and the level of intervention of the civil society, what do the citizens think, and we picked one particular street within this entire neighborhood, and within that we wanted to focus on some of the surface level problems, but also some of the deeper problems. So what we picked was the signage and the facades at a very cosmetic level, but really to get things started, to start involving more people. But then we also started looking into some of the sewage problems, because the sewage system that they have in the city is almost as old as the colonial times. It hasn't been upgraded, and that is a severe problem, not just because the density is increased, because population is increased, but also because commercial activity has really gone up. And on top of that, there is a river stream that flows from the hills and the Margalas through the city. And because of urbanization, there's a lot of garbage that's dumped into this stream. And there was a big flood, I forget the year now, I think it was 2011 or 2007. And it's not just that the river floods, this river is also connected to the sewage system. So when the river floods, the water also flows backwards into these open channels. A lot of the sewage system are still open, exposed drains. And then when these flow out, they go into people's homes. And it's not just a matter of water that they need to get rid of, it's sewage in people's homes. So it's a very big health and hygiene problem. When we scaled up the project, one of the neighborhoods in which I was doing some participatory workshop, people said that they had a rat infestation for months afterwards, after the flood happened, because yeah, the whole thing just kind of went berserk, and then the rats were like, where do we go? So that's an example of what happens when you don't plan cities around forces of nature as strong as water. So that was the pilot phase, and then UNDP got some funding, and then we scaled it up, and it was an interesting methodology that was developed at the Bangkok hub, and they were simultaneously doing projects in Nepal and Bangladesh, and I was leading the project for here in Pakistan, and it was a super intensive project where the crux of it was to really sort of build this coalition that brings everybody together. And I think as anybody who works with cities, you really understand you can't just pick up one tiny chunk. It's an entire system which is connected everywhere, right? Like you can't just solve mobility in one part of the city and not have it somehow connected to the bigger highways or the bigger arteries. And it's the same with the sewage system. But with this project, they wanted to bring in the municipal level officers, very important stakeholders, because they hold most of the power in terms of how things will be implemented, not just planning, but also financing it. And then in terms of financing, a lot of the financing either comes from the provincial end, but if you really kind of put a climate change spin on it, then it also comes from the Ministry of Climate Change. And then it just kind of funnels down to the local level. Now, the local level government is divided into lots of different departments. There is the commissionerate, there is the Rawalpindi, but there is a commissionerate, there's a Rawalpindi, they're called the RWMC, the Municipal Corporation. Then there's VASA, which is the water and sanitation. And then there's also the people who particularly take care of the garbage.
To be specific, actually, because the main interest, I think, right now indeed is also to understand, for example, if you talked about a very large scale problem, right? Which in particular here it's quite impressive with the scales of that. But and you also mentioned the kind of new methodology which was developed, and it was pilot right methodology, if I understand well, and then it was tested. So the methodology was, what exactly was it? So was it to bring people together from municipalities, also right, architects, researchers from different areas, or was there a particular kind of pipeline to follow in order to call it methodology, or what was it actually exactly?
What it was to firstly conduct like a baseline to say this is where we stand, and once we had done that, then it was bringing in all of these stakeholders, and then it was bringing in all of these actors and asking them, where do you think the problem lies? Because these are the people who have been working on the field, these are the people who have been working with the different mandates of the government. So there's no way that we can do this project without their ownership. So interviewing them very extensively, and then the whole premise of the project was to actually look at it from a climate change lens, to understand what are the biggest risks that the city is exposed to, and how is it that we can start planning for it. And the other component, of course, was bringing in the citizens, depending on how they were exposed to these climate change induced risks. And then using their input to design the strategy that can then be taken to the government to say, we've done all of this research, please use this to inform your future plans. And what we did was that after interviews, extensive interviews with the government officials as well as the people, we made a list of all the risks, and then we had a risk prioritization exercise with all of the stakeholders that we had been talking to, which included citizens, which included provincial level people, which included mostly the local level people. And this, I believe, was a very crucial step to bring everybody together, because quite often citizens are not included in these conversations. They are to kind of, you know, get some input from them and inform some kind of plans. But in terms of physical meetings, it doesn't happen as frequently. But it was quite a crucial step for this process.
And then for us accessing the risk, right? Assessing the risks, is it something which actually is possible to do just from qualitative interviews, or you also needed to take measurements, or like what was this based on?
So it was based on qualitative interviews with these people. Like I mentioned earlier, there isn't a lot of data available. So we really had to rely on what these people were telling us. So for instance, one of the municipal level people who are, well, they're not municipal level, but they're the rescue team, so like the emergency helpline. So they're the ones who work with very, very immediate risks, such as flooding, such as fires. And they were the ones who I think were the most informative in terms of all of the stakeholders that I'd spoken to, because they're on the field, they know what they're talking about, they deal with it on a daily basis. And they've seen changes happen over the course of 30 to 40 years.
Yeah,
so
they have knowledge, right? And
they
may not have
exactly.
all the digital version of what is it. So
yes,
but
yes.
what was the main challenge then to interview and to get information from the interview? Because now, right, quite often in Europe, and we talk about it later a bit, quite often we're used to, oh, we need, for example, to analyze part of the city, we get the data and then we start to analyze. How were you getting some information from these interviews? Was it easy to construct them, and like was part of this big UNDP project, or then it continued in some sub part?
I think one of the biggest challenges that I faced was, yeah, I think, and this applies not just with the national, with I think it just applies to all stakeholders, is that when we talk about climate change, whether we do it in academic settings or nonprofit settings, there's a certain language or a vernacular that we use to talk about it. So, you know, what is sustainability, and what is, you know, the carbon footprint, or what is, you know, a lot of these buzzwords are thrown together, which have a certain meaning to different stakeholders. But when you go talk to these people, there's a very different vernacular through which they understand things, especially when you talk to regular citizens who are the ones who are facing the impact of flooding, for instance. They will not understand like high level exposure, or they will not understand you know, the carbon footprint of cement being used, or they will not understand a lot of these high level things that we talk about. So yeah. but the information that they have is crucial, I find, because that is what informs, that is what the reality is, and that is what should be informing our work as well. And they have very unique perspectives and eyes on what is happening. So I think one of the biggest challenges was finding this middle ground of how can I translate what they are facing into these reports that I had to produce, and then inform my bosses essentially, or the strategy per se, which is then going to go to all of these other policy level people. But then also on the other hand, how do I kind of make it simpler and break it down into chunks to inform these people of what's happening? There's also a difference of language, right? Like, there are certain words that are also just not translatable. So, I mean,
so basically you needed to bring them back, not back, but you needed to bring them on the same middle ground, what sometimes people talk about, right? And I guess it's indeed a big challenge. But what were the main outcomes of funding or findings? If you mention, like, for example, I don't know, you realized that complexity was underestimated, or that it was actually right overseen like as a different problem? But what were the main surprises what you encountered at the end of it?
You mean in terms of my findings and my results?
Not actually. We are more interested here not only in results, but more on surprising kind of outcomes. Like, you know, when you don't really find that solution can be easily found, right? Because sometimes there is no solution, right? You need just to deal with the problem. And this is what we want to know. What were the main, what did you were surprised? What you took home from this project?
I don't know if what I took home from the project was so much of a surprise than of a validation. But, and then this is something that we talked about earlier before, I think it would be very naive to just take things at face value, but there's a power structure within all of this. And we can talk about this a bit later when we talk about differences between Europe and Asia and Pakistan in particular. But as you mentioned already, there are a lot of international NGOs that are coming in with a development agenda on how cities should work in Pakistan, right? So they hold a certain bargaining chip. The national government holds a certain bargaining chip. And when I say bargaining chip, I really mean power, and by power, I really mean funding capacity, and the ability to execute projects and really decide what is going to happen on the ground. And I talked about the citizens and the people earlier, and sadly so, they don't hold many bargaining chips. However, their perspective as a researcher, I think, is the most important. And I think quite often, I think over the past 10 years or so, I'm not a very long development practitioner, but I find that this focus on urban participation, people participation has become quite large, but I don't think that that's necessarily possible in its truest and honest sense unless the people hold some kind of power or bargaining chip to not just present their agenda, but follow through with it also. And it's also difficult for me as a person who's researching and then also proposing things, because I have to maintain a certain neutrality and objectivity, because I'm just here to do my research and to do it well and produce work well, because that's what I'm being paid to do. I have no liberty or maneuverability over this power structure. And that can be quite often frustrating, because, you know, you put in a lot of work. There's also expectations from my end, and I would like to see it being executed. If not executed, then at least taken to a certain level where somebody can analyze it further and be like, this was right, this was not right, let's work on it a bit more. But let's take it somewhere. There's a certain amount of resources that have been invested into this. Let's not leave this project where it is. And that's also something that I find a bit problematic with these different level of stakeholders with different levels of power. I think the more stakeholders with varied amounts of power, when they come in, they also change the agenda quite a bit, depending on their level of power.
You mean that they changed to adapt it, or change agenda for some other reasons?
I think it's not a static thing. Like I mentioned, like some of the municipality level heads are elected positions. So one person could want one thing and another person could want something else. And that's also a big challenge that we find with working with governments in Pakistan, is that there isn't like a 5-year plan. There isn't like a 10-year plan. Sometimes there isn't even like a 1-year plan. There's people who want to come and do good work, but it becomes difficult to do because they don't stay in that position for too long.
And do you think this is actually one of the main difference between Europe and Asia? Or like if we come to big question we started with, what for you the main differences and experiences from projects there?
I think it's firstly, if you look at it also just at a surface level, as somebody who's just visiting Europe, you will see that the level of complexity that we deal with are so different. You know, in Pakistan, we're still solving problems of sewage and solid waste and liquid waste, whereas in Europe, that was something of the past. Yeah, it was something that you guys were working on, or Europeans were working on, maybe something like 30, 40 years ago. Now they're doing super technical things like cloud burst technology. So, you know, you have courtyards within your building that can absorb water. And it's taking it up a notch each time. And I guess now with the new EU Green Deal, there's a new level of complexity, which I think is a brilliant tool. Like all the cities working towards net zero city targets. So how do you build more sustainably? How do you make your transport more sustainable? Which is a level of complexity, and the knowledge and the tools with which people operate in Europe is just very, very different. And I think another thing that makes a lot of difference is that I see a lot of collaboration between universities, so academic settings where you can really be experimental, and then connected to what's happening on the ground. And so Young Yale, for instance, collects a lot of data on just people on the street, for instance, you know, down from like just counting people. To inform, okay, this is how wide your street needs to be, this is where you should install a traffic light, this is where the bike lane should be bigger or smaller. We don't have that connection to academia either, as far as I know. There are institutions who are working on it, but I think it can definitely be bolstered, it can definitely be made bigger, because there's 5 heads are better than one.
Yes, but do you think that then re-educating or changing the way how we educate people, for example, in Europe or in Asia, right, about urbanism and urban problems, or maybe inviting more people to think about these problems, like, you know, like there are many attempts of doing that with project-based learning, could maybe contribute to solving this? This is one of the last questions which I wanted to discuss, so feel free to kind of make your own view on that.
So what you're asking is people who are being educated in Europe, how can they contribute to cities in Asia?
Not only, but also that, because sometimes if we look into way how we teach people to solve problems, right? Sometimes when we come to the battlefield of problems, we are finding ourselves not really able to do that, because complexity level you mentioned is very high. So maybe that's one of the way to approach to the problem. And you do you agree with the statement that education also wise it could be approached differently?
So my general comment about education, not just with my education with architecture and urban studies, but also something that I hear from architects and urban planners within Europe and also Pakistan, is also that quite often we're almost raised with delusions of this is how this works, you know, and in architecture, I see the importance of that, because, you know, you really have to be imaginative, and you can design these crazy buildings that are hanging from the edge of a cliff, and you really need to fuel your imagination, you know. And quite often architecture students are sitting with art students, so, you know, those things kind of transpire as well. And to be very honest, I had a lot of fun in my architecture school, where I was like designing these bizarre buildings. But then when I got to the drawing board at work, it was about, oh, will this structure stand or not? So I think, and that I also find in quite a lot of students who then turn into professionals, that there's almost this disappointment of, oh, but you know, we thought we were going to change the world. And I wouldn't say this if I hadn't heard it from so many different people. And I graduated 5 years ago now. I think I also really had to struggle with it. I think I also had this naive yet hopeful idea of, oh, but we can change the world if your intentions and your hearts are in the right place. Especially in this day and age, I think we really need hope. We really need to do the work and still expect good to come out of it. But I think it's also important to remember that the situation is a lot more complex, and the power structure, like I talked about, I don't think it's different in Europe also. I think there's a lot of bureaucracy happening. There's a lot of things, if not coming from the UN or the World Bank or the ADB, are coming from the EU agenda. And then there's fossil fuel lobbies, and then there's all of these other environmental lobbies that push for a different kind of focus. So
yeah. I think I wanted to come back to this really inspiring point you mentioned on imagination, which is a key word for me. And if there would be maybe one thing which you could recommend to young urbanists or to people who are working or want to work in this area in order to actually keep their imagination awake, is it a book or maybe some exercise or whatever you were taught in all the places you were working in? What would that be?
I don't know. To keep their imagination alive, I don't know. I think over the past 3 or 4 years, I've become more sporty than I was before, and I find nature quite inspiring, and it really fuels my imagination. We're talking about urban systems, but I think we quite often forget, and that's just a struggle of humankind. I think we think that we're better, but I think there's systems that have existed long before us, such as the trees, such as the ocean, and how all of these things connect together. So for me, I particularly find nature quite fascinating. So just an interesting fact that I will share. I've been very fascinated by whales recently, and I was reading about whales, and I found out that, and don't quote me on the exact figures, but I think when a whale dies and goes to the bottom of the ocean, it takes something like 10,000 tons of carbon back to the ground, and that's the equivalent of, I don't know, 20 hectares of a forest. So, and I think the way forward in this day and age with what's happening with climate change now is that you really have to put measures in place where you respect nature, where you design with nature. And I'm not just saying, oh, let's plug in a park here and let's plant some trees there, and but make way for streams through your cities. Plant gardens around them, plant vegetable patches around them, produce your own food locally. I think that's what I would say.
That's very motivating point, I think, to and continue later the discussions. It was really inspiring actually to talk about challenging problems, because I think you always kept up. So thanks a lot for your time and for sharing.
Yeah.
So
thanks a lot.
Yes, thanks a lot.